The rain on the day Eleanor Vance moved to Raven's Gate was not a gentle, welcoming drizzle. It was a spiteful, horizontal deluge that turned the quaint cobblestone streets of the historic London district into treacherous mirrors and made the Georgian townhouses appear hunched and miserable under the leaden sky. Eleanor, wrestling a sodden cardboard box marked "Fragile Kitchen" through the stubborn, black-painted door of number 7, felt a profound and immediate regret. This move, a desperate leap towards independence at 38, now felt like a cartoonish act of self-sabotage. "Almost, love, almost," came the cheerful bellow from behind her. Barry, the removal man, a mountain of a man in a waterproof jacket that strained at its seams, gave the box a final shove, propelling it and Eleanor into the dim hallway. He shook himself like a Saint Bernard, sending a spray of rainwater across the freshly sanded floorboards. Right then. That's the lock. We'll be snug as a bug here. Lovely street. Quiet. Quiet. That was the word the estate agent had used, too. A wonderfully quiet, characterful cul-de-sac, Ms. Vance. A community. Eleanor, her nerves frayed by a year of sleepless nights in her noisy, ex-shared flat in Bermondsey, had latched onto that word. Quiet. It had seemed like a bomb. Now, standing in the gloom of the hallway, the only sound the relentless drumming of rain on the fanlight and the ominous gurgle of a downpipe, quiet, felt suffocating. "Thank you, Barry," she said, forcing a smile and pressing a damn 20 into his hand. He touched his forehead and vanished back into the storm, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the empty house. Alone. The silence descended, thick and velvety. It wasn't a true silence, she realized as her ears adjusted. There was the rain, the creak of old timber settling, and a faint, rhythmic sound from next door. Tap, 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 tap. It was precise, patient. Perhaps someone knitting, or typing. It was human, at least. A sign of life. The week that followed was a blur of unpacking, assembling flat-pack furniture that seemed designed by sadists, and battling the eccentricities of a 19th-century plumbing system. The cul-de-sac, Raven's Gate, revealed itself to be a perfect little crescent of 5 three-story townhouses, arranged like teeth in a slightly crooked smile. Number 7, her new home, was in the middle. To her left, at number 5, lived Mrs. Abercrombie, a formidable octogenarian with a penchant for peering through her net curtains and who had already hopped round, with a suspiciously dry rock cake and a list of acceptable bidets. To her right, at number 9, was the source of the tapping. She had seen him only once, a fleeting glimpse as she struggled with her recycling boxes. The door of number 9 had opened and a man had emerged. He was tall, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, with immaculately styled silver gray hair and the kind of sharp, elegant features that spoke of good breeding and careful maintenance. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat and carried a sleek leather briefcase. His movements were economical, graceful. He had turned, locked his door with a deliberate click, and then his eyes had met hers. They were a pale, unnerving blue, like chips of winter sky. He didn't smile, but gave a single, slight nod, a gesture of such minimal acknowledgement it bordered on insult, before striding away down the cobbles, his polished Oxfords making no sound. "That's Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Abercrombie had hissed later, appearing at Eleanor's elbow as if conjured by the mere act of observation. "Alistair Thorne keeps himself to himself. A gentleman." She said the word "gentleman" with a peculiar emphasis, as if it were a title he earned through sheer force of will. "Financial advisor, or something in the city. Very respectable. Quiet." There it was again. Quiet. Eleanor, a freelance copy editor whose world was one of track changes and semantic nuance, tried to settle into the quiet. Her home office was at the back of the first floor, overlooking the shared, walled gardens that ran behind the houses. Number 9's garden was a shop. Where hers and Mrs. Abercrombie's were modest patches of unruly lawn and neglected rose bushes, Thorne's was a geometric masterpiece. Neat, razor-straight gravel paths divided manicured beds of dark green box hedges. There were no flowers, no color. It was a garden of shape and shadow, austere and controlled. Just like the man, she thought. The tapping continued, a constant, low-level soundtrack to her days. It seemed to come from his study, a room that backed onto her own small spare bedroom. Tap, tap, scrape, tap. Sometimes it would stop for an hour, only to resonate with a metronomic regularity that set her teeth on edge. She found herself listening for it, her own concentration broken by its cessation or its unexpected rhythms. Her first proper encounter with Alistair Thorne occurred 10 days after she moved in. She was returning from the supermarket, her arms aching with bags, when she fumbled her keys at the doorstep. As she cursed under her breath, the door to number 9 opened silently. "Allow me," a voice said, smooth as polished marble. He was beside her in 2 strides, taking the heavy bag from her grasp with effortless strength. His hands were long-fingered, clean, with perfectly trimmed nails. "Oh, thank you," Eleanor stammered, flustered. "Not at all, Eleanor, isn't it? I am Alistair Thorne." He didn't offer to shake hands, merely held the bag while she unlocked the door. His proximity was unsettling. He smelled of sandalwood and something colder, like ozone after a lightning strike. "Yes, Eleanor Vance. I just moved in next door. So I observed. I do hope the removal process wasn't too disruptive." His eyes scanned her face, not with curiosity, but with an appraising coldness, like a jeweler assessing a stone of dubious value. No, it was fine. Thank you for the help." He placed the bag just inside her hallway with a precision that suggested he was noting the layout, the stacked boxes, her disarray. "A pleasure. Raven's Gate is a singular place. We value our peace here." The pale blue eyes held hers. "Our privacy. It wasn't a threat, it was simply a statement, delivered with the weight of absolute fact." He gave another of his infinitesimal nods and retreated to his own doorstep. As he opened his door, Eleanor caught a glimpse of his hallway. It was obsessively neat. A single, antique hall table with a base holding not flowers, but an arrangement of bleached branches. The walls were painted a dark, matte gray. Then the door closed, sealing him in his silent, ordered world inside. That night, the tapping was different. Louder, more insistent. Thud, thud thud, scrape, thud. It went on past midnight. Eleanor, ear pressed to the wall of her spare room, felt a pulse of irrational anger. This was her quiet. She paid for it with every exhausting box, every moment of doubt. She was about to go and bang on the wall when it stopped. The ensuing silence was deeper, more profound than before. In it, she heard a new sound from number 9. A low, rhythmic, grating sound. A sound like a saw, moving slowly through resistant wood. She told herself it was nothing. A DIY project. A keen woodworker. But the image of Alistair Thorne in an apron, lovingly crafting a birdhouse, wouldn't coalesce. The sound evoked something else. Something patient, and deliberate, and sharp. The next morning, a Saturday, brought a break in the weather. Weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. Determined to reclaim her peace, Eleanor decided to tackle her jungle of a garden. As she wrestled with a particularly vicious bramble at the far end, near the high brick wall that separated her plot from Thorne's, she saw something pale caught in the thorns on his side. It was a rag, or perhaps a piece of cloth. Without thinking, she reached over, her fingers closing on damp, rough material. She tugged it free. It wasn't a rag, it was a shirt cuff, torn and stained with dark, rusty patches that could have been old paint, or mud. But it wasn't. The fabric was expensive, a thick white cotton, now gray with grime. And sewn into the cuff, just visible, were two initials in black thread, A.T. Asterisk. A cold trickle, unrelated to the damp air, traced its way down her spine. She stared at the stains. They were smeared, as if someone with dirty hands had gripped hard. She dropped the cuff as if it were a live insect. It fluttered back onto Thorne's pristine gravel. "Find something interesting." The voice, so close, made her jolt and let out a small cry. Alistair Thorne was standing on his gravel path, not 5 feet away. He wore tailored gardening trousers and a crisp linen shirt, sleeves rolled precisely to the elbows. He held a pair of secateurs, their blades gleaming. She hadn't heard him approach at all. A piece of cloth. It was caught. I thought it was mine," she babbled, her heart hammering. His eyes flicked to the cuff on the gravel, then back to her face. His expression was one of polite, icy inquiry. "How careless of me. An old gardening shirt. I must have snagged it." He didn't move to pick it up. "Your brambles are quite the menace. They have a predatory nature, don't you think? Reaching through boundaries, claiming what isn't theirs." He took a step closer to the wall. He was taller than she'd realized up close. "I must commend you, Eleanor. It takes courage to move to a new place alone. So many vulnerabilities." He smiled then. It was a perfect, practiced rearrangement of his features that involved no warmth reaching his eyes. "Do be careful with those thorns. They can inflict a surprisingly deep wound." He turned and walked back towards his house, the secateurs held loosely at his side. Eleanor stood frozen, the image of the stained cuff and the cold, assessing look in his eyes burning in her mind. The sun vanished behind a cloud, plunging the garden back into gloom. The incident with the cuff marked a shift. Eleanor's perception of the quiet changed. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence. A listening silence. She began to notice other things. The regularity of Thorne's life was absolute. He left for work at 7:15 a.m. precisely, returned at 6:30 p.m. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he went out again at 8 p.m., returning by 10:30. She knew this because she found herself unconsciously noting his comings and goings from her office window. The tapping continued, a maddening, cryptic Morse code. She started to dream about it. Dreams where the tapping was the sound of a fingernail on a coffin lid, or a single drop of water falling onto a stone floor in an infinite, dark space. Then, the first gift arrived. It was a Monday morning. A small, gift-wrapped box, no bigger than a ring box, sat on her doormat. There was no card. The paper was a rich, dark green, the bow perfectly symmetrical. Puzzled and slightly unnerved, she took it to her kitchen table and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of white cotton wool, was a dead shrew. It was laid on its back, tiny paws folded neatly over its chest. Its eyes were closed. It looked almost peaceful, arranged with a grotesque care. A faint, sweet smell of decay rose from the box. Eleanor recoiled, a scream choking in her throat. She slammed the lid shut, her hands trembling. A sick joke, a warning. From whom? Her mind flew to Thorne, to his cold smile and his talk of predatory brambles. But it made no sense. It was too bizarre, too childish. Shaken, she disposed of the box in the outside bin. washing her hands until they were raw. She considered calling the police, but with what? A dead mouse from a secret admirer. They would think she was hysterical. She decided not to mention it to Mrs. Abercrombie, whose gossip would only amplify her fear. 2 days later, a second box appeared. This one was slightly larger. With dread coiling in her stomach, she opened it on the doorstep, ready to fling it away. Inside was a perfect, miniature replica of her own house, number 7, carved from a pale, polished wood. The detail was exquisite. The tiny panes in the windows, the brass knocker, even the potted fern she placed by the door. It was beautiful, and utterly terrifying. Who had the skill, the time, the motive to do this? She turned it over. On the base, in tiny, burned letters, were the words, "A house should be a home." Asterisk. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. The tapping, the sawing sound. Thorne. This time, she acted. She marched next door, the carved house clenched in her fist. Her knocks were sharp, angry echoes in the quiet cul-de-sac. The door opened. Alistair Thorne stood there, dressed in a navy silk dressing gown over trousers. He looked freshly showered. "Eleanor, to what do I owe the pleasure?" His tone was mild, but his eyes went immediately to the object in her hand. "Did you leave this on my doorstep?" Her voice was tighter than she intended. He took the carved house from her, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, cold and electric, went through her. He examined it with what seemed like genuine appreciation. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Late 19th century, I'd say. A folk art piece. Where did you find it? It was left for me. In a box. Like the dead animal earlier this week. His brow furrowed, a perfect mimicry of concerned confusion. A dead animal. How vile. I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor. But why would you think this has anything to do with me? He held the carving up. This is not my work. I have an appreciation for fine things, but my talents lie elsewhere. In finance. In order. He handed it back to her. Ravens Gate is a safe street. But London is a large city. There are unstable people everywhere. Perhaps you've attracted the attention of someone. Your isolation here, it can be noted. He was reframing the narrative, expertly. Making her the vulnerable one, the unstable one. The tapping, she blurted out. At night, from your house, it sounds like carving. For the first time, a real emotion flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but a spark of intense, focused interest. The tapping. Ah, my metronome. I play the piano, you see. Very poorly, I'm afraid. I use a metronome to keep time while I practice scales. It can be repetitive. I do apologize if it has disturbed you. I shall endeavor to be more considerate. A lie, smooth, seamless, and utterly unverifiable. She had never heard piano scales. I don't believe you, she said, but the force had gone from her voice. His smile returned, thin and sharp. Belief is such a fragile thing, Eleanor. It requires evidence. You have a curious little carving and a dead rodent. I have a metronome and a concern for my new neighbor's welfare. Who do you think the authorities will find more credible? He leaned forward, just slightly, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur. Let me offer some advice, as a friend. The mind, when under stress, when alone, can concoct the most elaborate fictions. It is a defense mechanism. Perhaps this move has been more taxing than you realized. Perhaps you should consider arrest. He closed the door, leaving her standing on the step, the cold wooden house in her hand, more isolated and uncertain than ever. The campaign of subtle terror escalated, always deniable, always wrapped in the plausible. A week after the carving, the street's elderly lamplighter, the cul-de-sac retained antique, manually lit gas lamps, mentioned to her that Mr. Thorne had been so helpful, providing him with a special oil that made the flame outside number 7 burn with a peculiar, greenish tinge at night. Eleanor saw it, a sickly emerald glow that made her skin look cadaverous. Her cat, a placid tabby named Malkin, whom she brought from her old flat, vanished for 2 days. He returned listless, with a patch of fur shaved neatly from his flank, revealing unbroken skin. He flinched when she picked him up. Then, the sounds in the wall started. Not tapping, but a soft, skittering rustle, like many small feet moving in the cavity between her house and Thorne's. It would start an hour after he returned home and stop the moment he left in the morning. An exterminator found nothing. Mice, love, probably, he said. Old houses. But Eleanor knew. She knew. This was Thorne's design. He was an engineer of fear, a connoisseur of unease. He was studying her, testing the boundaries of her sanity, applying pressure with the precision of a surgeon. The quiet of Raven's Gate was his laboratory, and she was his subject. Her work suffered. She jumped at shadows. She lay awake at night, listening to the rustling in the walls and the occasional, definitive tap from next door. She stopped going into her garden. Mrs. Abercrombie, noticing her pallor and jumpiness, clucked about, city girls, not being suited to proper neighborhoods. Eleanor's breaking point, and the point at which her fear curdled into a desperate resolve, came with the photographs. They arrived in a plain manila envelope, slipped through her letterbox. They were black and white, printed on high-quality paper. They were of her. One, taken through her kitchen window, showed her washing up, her face drawn and tired. Another, shot from an angle that suggested the photographer was in her garden at night, showed her in her bedroom, pulling the curtains closed. The most intimate one was a close-up of her face, taken while she slept. She looked peaceful, vulnerable. There was no doubt. The perspective was from within her own home. He had been inside. A cold, clear fury rose in her, burning away the last of her paralyzing terror. This was not just harassment, it was a violation. And the police, with Thorne's impeccable respectability and her own lack of concrete proof, would be useless. She was alone with a predator who wore the mask of a gentleman. She had to fight back, but not like a victim. She had to understand him. To beat a monster, you had to think like one. She began her own surveillance. She noted not just Thorne's schedule, but the patterns within it. The Tuesday and Thursday night outings were key. Where did he go? Using a small, powerful telescope she ordered online, for birdwatching, she watched from her darkened office as he left those evenings. He walked to the end of Raven's Gate, but instead of turning towards the bustling high street, he took the narrow, ill-lit alley that led towards the old riverside warehouses. One Thursday, driven by a courage born of utter desperation, she followed him. She kept a ridiculous distance, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The warehouse district was a skeletal place of crumbling brick and shattered windows, a world away from the prim respectability of Raven's Gate. Thorne moved through it like a ghost, his elegant figure incongruous against the graffiti and decay. He stopped at a particularly dilapidated building, its door held shut by a heavy chain and padlock. He produced a key, unlocked it, and slipped inside. A faint, yellow light flickered in a second-story window. This was his place, his secret place, the source, she felt with a bone-deep certainty, of the true horror. Getting in would be impossible. But she could watch. Over the next week, using savings she couldn't afford, she bought equipment. a directional microphone, a long-range digital camera with night vision. She set up her observation post in a derelict building opposite, its roof offering a perilous but clear view of the warehouse's second-floor window. What she witnessed over the next 2 nights of his visits confirmed her worst nightmares and yet made no logical sense. Through the grainy green lens of the night vision, she saw Thorne in what looked like a workshop. But it was no ordinary workshop. There were no half-finished cabinets or tool racks. The walls were lined with shelves holding rows of glass jars. In them, suspended in clear fluid, were things. Shapes she couldn't quite identify in the low resolution. Organic shapes. He wasn't carving wood. He was at a steel table, wearing a dark apron. He was working with something pale and pliant. Clay. No. The texture was wrong. He would lean over it, his movements those of a sculptor or a surgeon, utterly absorbed. Sometimes he would consult large, leather-bound books that lay open on a stand. The tapping she heard at home. Here, it was the sound of small metal tools, of something being meticulously shaped. He was creating something, or someone. The realization dawned on her with a slow, creeping horror. The initial shock of seeing him engaged in this secret, obsessive activity gave way to a deeper, more unsettling analysis. She watched the way he handled the material, not with the rough impatience of a builder, but with a terrifying tenderness, a lover's caress. His focus was absolute, a world away from the cold, controlled demeanor he displayed on Raven's Gate. Here, in this filthy sanctuary, he was passionate. He was an artist, and she was his latest muse. The pieces, grotesque as they were, began to fit together. The dead shrew, posed peacefully, a study in stillness. The perfect replica of her house, an exercise in capturing form and detail. The photographs, reference material, the sounds in the walls. Could he be placing things there? Listening devices, or something else? He was building a portfolio, a comprehensive study of her. Her environment, her behavior, her likeness. But to what end? The answer came from the jars, from the nature of the material on his table. This wasn't about replication in wood or clay. This was about preservation, about permanence. He wasn't just watching her. He was preparing her. The fear that returned then was of a different order. It was no longer the fear of harassment, of a creepy neighbor. It was the ice-water dread of being chosen by a collector. A collector whose medium was not art, but life, frozen and arranged. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, freelance copy editor. She was a subject, a specimen. And a specimen, once properly studied, is always, always mounted. Flight was her first, primal instinct. Pack a bag, run, never look back. But 2 things stopped her. First, the practical. Where would she go? Her resources were tied up in number 7. Thorne had connections, resources. He would find her. He had her photograph sleeping. He knew her patterns down to her subconscious breaths. He would consider her flight not an escape, but the thrilling first move in a new phase of the hunt. Second, and more powerful, was the fury. The cold, clean anger that had ignited when she saw the photographs. He had stolen her peace, her safety, her very identity. He had reduced her to a project. Running would mean he won. It would mean surrendering to the role he had assigned her. The victim, the fragile thing to be taken apart and reassembled according to his design. No, she would not run. She would fight. But to fight a monster who operated in the shadows, who weaponized plausibility and respectability, she would have to descend into the shadows herself. She would have to become something he did not expect. Not prey, but a predator. Not a specimen, but a fellow artist. An artist of survival. Her plan began not with an attack, but with an offering. A piece of performance art for an audience of one. She bought a mannequin from a charity shop, a female form with bland, featureless polystyrene face. She dressed it in one of her own dresses, one Thorne would have seen her wear in the garden. Using her own makeup and a cheap wig styled like her hair, she did her best to make it a crude effigy of herself. Then, one afternoon when she knew Thorne was at his city office, she placed it in her back garden. She positioned it kneeling, as if tending to a flower bed, its face turned slightly towards number 9. She watched from her kitchen, heart thudding, as he returned home at 6:30. She saw him enter his garden, a glass of something amber in his hand. He stopped. He saw the mannequin. He didn't startle, didn't drop his glass. He simply stood, utterly still, for a full minute. Then, slowly, he raised his glass towards it in a silent, mocking toast. A smile touched his lips, a real one, this time, wide and full of a dreadful delight. He was pleased. He thought she was playing his game. He thought she was acknowledging his power, presenting herself for his appraisal. Good, she thought, a bitter taste in her mouth. Let him think that, let him be amused. The next phase was information. She needed to know what was in that warehouse. She needed proof that was undeniable, something that could shatter his mask of respectability forever. Breaking in was out of the question. The security, she was sure, would be formidable. But everyone has a weak spot. For Alistair Thorne, she suspected it was his pride, his sense of intellectual superiority. She began to leave things for him to find. Not threats, but clues. Puzzles. She printed out a line of poetry from Eliot's The Waste Land. I will show you fear in a handful of dust, and left it in her recycling bin, knowing he would go through it. She played a specific, obscure piece of atonal music by Schoenberg loudly one evening, music that was mathematically precise and emotionally cold, music she thought would appeal to him. She was curating a persona, the intelligent, challenging victim. One worthy of his great project. It worked. His tactics changed. The petty torments ceased. The silence from number 9 became profound, watchful. He was reassessing her. She had moved from being a passive subject to an active participant. She had his attention in a new, and even more dangerous, way. Her chance came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Abercrombie. The old woman cornered her one morning, her eyes bright with gossip. Heard from the postman. I did. Mr. Thorne's had a delivery. A big one. Came in a refrigerated van, no less. All the way from some specialist place in Germany. Medical supplies, the driver said. For his condition. Condition? Eleanor asked, her blood turning to ice. Oh, he's got some rare blood thing, poor man. Needs special treatments. Keeps it very private, of course. A gentleman. She said it with a sigh of sympathy. A refrigerated van. Medical supplies from Germany. It wasn't for a condition. It was for his work. Preservation fluid. Chemicals. She had to see inside that warehouse now. The next Tuesday, armed with her camera, a lock-picking set she'd watched tutorials on until her eyes glowed, and a can of pepper spray, she approached the warehouse an hour before Thorne was due. The padlock on the main door was formidable, but the building was old. She found a ground-level window at the back, its frame rotten. Using a crowbar from her toolkit, she pried it open with a splintering crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent yard. She climbed into darkness and the smell of damp brick, disinfectant, and something else, a sweet, cloying chemical odor that made her gag. Using a small, powerful torch, she swept the beam around. She was in a storage room. Crates were stacked against the walls. One was open, packed with styrofoam pellets. She reached in and pulled out a glass jar. Bringing her torch close, she looked. And she screamed. The sound was muffled, torn from her throat and dying in the thick, chemical air. Floating in the clear, viscous fluid was a human eye. It was blue, wide open, staring at her with an expression of eternal surprise. The optic nerve trailed from it like a tiny, pale worm. She dropped the jar. It hit the concrete floor but didn't break, rolling away, the eye tumbling inside. Her torch beam danced wildly, illuminating other crates, other jars. A row of hands, severed at the wrist, fingers gracefully arranged. A section of tattooed skin, stretched and pinned like a butterfly. A heart, dark and enormous, suspended in its glass prison. This was not just a workshop. It was an archive, a gallery. She staggered back, bile rising in her throat. This was beyond serial murder. This was taxonomy, collection. This was the work of a man who saw people not as beings, but as assemblages of fascinating parts. Her terror wanted her to flee, to run screaming into the night. But the cold, furious part of her, the part that had become an artist of survival, made her raise the camera. She took pictures, her hands shaking so violently the images would be blurry, but they would be proof. Jar after jar, specimen after specimen. She moved into the main workshop area. The steel table was clean, gleaming. The tools laid out beside it were not a carpenter's or a sculptor's, but a surgeon's. Scalpels, bone saws, retractors, all meticulously arranged. The books on the stand were not ledgers, but ancient anatomical texts and modern volumes on plasticizing techniques and polymer chemistry. On a smaller table sat a project in progress. A face, life-sized, rendered in a flesh-colored, waxy material. It was a young man's face, handsome, with a strong jaw and closed eyes. It was terrifyingly realistic. It was also, she realized with a fresh wave of nausea, not modeled from clay or wax. The pores, the fine vellus hairs, it was a real face, treated, preserved, mounted on some underlying form. This was his masterpiece, not killing, but recreation. He was building a person. A sound from below, a key in the main door. He was early. Panic electrified her. She looked around wildly. There was only one door out of the workshop, the one she'd come through. The footsteps were on the stairs now, steady, unhurried. She saw a large metal cabinet against the far wall and dove behind it, squeezing into the narrow gap just as the workshop door opened. The lights flicked on, harsh fluorescent bars that hummed to life. She saw Thorne's polished shoes stop just inside the doorway. He stood there, silent. He knew. He could smell her fear, the disturbance in his sterile air. Eleanor. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. It was calm, almost welcoming. I must admit, I'm impressed. I didn't think you had the fortitude for this. You've progressed from garden ornaments to breaking and entering. A significant evolution. He began to move, his footsteps circling the steel table. You've seen my work. What do you think? Is it not sublime? Most people are so ephemeral. A flash of anger, a moment of beauty, then decay. I arrest that decay. I find the essential forms. The curve of a lip, the helix of an ear, the baffling complexity of a liver, and I grant them permanence. I create monuments to the fleeting human machine. He was closer now. She could see the hem of his coat. He paused by the table with the vase. This is Jeremy. He was a pianist. Such beautiful hands. I've kept them separate, of course. One must appreciate the components as well as the whole. Her muscles were cramping. She held her breath. You have remarkable eyes, Eleanor. A most unusual shade of hazel. almost green in certain lights. They have a clarity, an intelligence. They observe. I knew from the moment I saw you wrestling with your boxes that you were different. Not like the others on the street. Mrs. Abercrombie, for instance. Her form is generic, her mind a repetitive loop. She is not worth the effort. But you have texture, complexity, a history of quiet sadness I find utterly captivating. He was right behind the cabinet now. She could hear his breathing. Come out, my dear. There's no need for this squalor. You've passed the audition. You were ready for the final casting. She had one chance. As he leaned to look behind the cabinet, she exploded from her hiding place, not away from him, but towards the steel table. Her hand closed around the handle of a large, heavy bone saw. She swung it wildly, not at him, but at the jarred specimens on a nearby shelf. Glass exploded. Formaldehyde and preserved tissue showered the floor in a stinking, slippery deluge. Thorne let out a sound. Not a scream, but a roar of pure, undiluted rage. It was the sound of a collector watching his priceless gallery being vandalized. You wretch. You blind, destructive thing. He slipped on the wet floor, going down on one knee. Eleanor didn't wait. She sprinted for the door, down the stairs, and out into the alleyway. She ran until her lungs burned, not stopping until she collapsed, sobbing, in the well-lit doorway of a late-night supermarket miles away. She had the proof. Blurry, horrific photos on her camera. But she had also triggered the final phase. The genteel predator was gone. She had seen the raw, furious beast beneath. He would come for her now. Not to study, but to reclaim. To salvage his damaged masterpiece. The police, when she finally staggered into a station, their fluorescent lights a shocking contrast to the warehouse gloom, were skeptical at first. A respectable financier, a warehouse of body parts. It sounded like the ravings of a hysterical woman. But the photos, however blurry, were undeniable. The eye, the hands. They agreed to investigate, with caution. They found the warehouse cleaned out. Spotless. No jars, no tools, no face named Jeremy. Only the smell of industrial bleach and the lingering, ghostly chill of a refrigeration unit. Thorne, contacted at his home, expressed polite bafflement. He admitted to renting the warehouse for storage of archival financial documents, which he had recently moved to a more secure facility. He suggested Ms. Vance, his unstable neighbor, had perhaps experienced a psychotic episode, fueled by her isolation and an unhealthy fixation on him. He was calm, plausible, and devastatingly credible. Without a body, without forensic evidence from the warehouse, the case stalled. A detective with kind eyes told her they'd keep an open file, but there was nothing more they could do. They suggested she consider moving, for her own peace of mind. Peace of mind. The phrase was a mockery. She returned to Raven's Gate, a shell of herself. The street was quieter than ever. Mrs. Abercrombie peered from behind her lace, whispering to the postman. Thorne's house, number 9, was a silent, dark monument. He was gone. The estate agent's board went up the next day. For sale, a stunning period home. He had vanished. But Eleanor knew, with a certainty that was deeper than bone, that he had not finished. He had not gotten what he came for. Her. His perfect, challenging subject. His magnum opus. He was out there, in the quiet spaces of the city, licking his wounds, planning his final, perfect acquisition. The game had not ended. It had merely entered its most deadly and elegant phase, the endgame. She sat in her dark living room at number 7, the carved replica of her house sitting on the mantelpiece. She picked it up, feeling the smooth, cold wood. with a scream, but with a smile. Not with flight, but with a welcome. For she had a new project now, too. Not editing words, but editing fate. Her research was complete, her tools were prepared, and her subject, the fascinating, complex Mr. Alistair Thorne, was long overdue for his final, permanent appraisal. The quiet held its breath. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.